for being here. Before I start, I just want to have a quick shout out to Varsity. As she thanked the folks who were involved with setting up this amazing night, she did not thank herself. And I think that most of this evening is attributed to her and her great idea, and then all of the work that Senate put behind that. So if we can just do a quick round of applause for Varsity. And as Colin said, I also want to thank all of you that are here tonight. It is 100% easier probably not to be here, so thank you for coming over to Porter Hall and being here. I also am very excited to follow Colin, although a little bit nervous because those were some big footsteps to fill. So amazing job, Colin, and thank you for starting out the evening for us. So when I first was asked to take part in this experience, I was asked to talk about what I learned at CMU. Now that was sort of a difficult question to answer because I have learned a lot of things. From year one and being sort of that freshman girl who was playing trombone in Kilty Pan wearing the moose hat, to the girl in my second year who was pushing buggy, to my third year when I was the CA of the Res and dressed in all pink for orientation, to my fourth year where I was playing with penguins in the University Center as a student body president. I have learned a ton of different things. And as some of our previous lecturers have talked about, it's really hard to distill what you've learned down into 20 minutes. So I have one big takeaway, but first to understand that takeaway, you need to understand a little bit more about me and my experience here at CMU. Now, I wouldn't consider myself to be a person that has that great of a memory. The number of times that I've locked myself out of my room in the last month alone is an embarrassing amount that I can't share with you here. So I don't consider myself to be a person with that great of a memory, but I do have a good knack of remembering advice for some reason. Sometimes intentional advice that people have told me, and other times advice that I think people didn't really mean to put out there as advice, but I sort of take as advice. For example, my grandmother once told me that any person looks better if they're smiling. I don't really know where that came from. One day she just said, "Lindsay, people who smile look more attractive." And I said, "Okay, thanks, Grandma. I'll remember that one." The next thing that someone told me was my father once told me that the customer is always right. My father owned small businesses, and he always had taught me that the customer is always right. That's one of those things that just stays with me. Another thing that someone once told me is that you'll learn the most from your friends. A very good friend of mine said that he tries to pick out one thing that his friends have really taught him. Each friend, there's that one particular thing. I think maybe that's the thing that I learned from him. My mother told me to always undercook your brownies. This is a very important piece of advice. Overcooked brownies are literally the worst thing in the entire world, so please always undercook your brownies. Now, another thing about advice, though, is that sometimes these things can weigh on us and affect us in different ways. One piece of advice that did that for me was this piece of advice from my high school calc teacher. She said to me and the entire class that to be successful, you must study something technical. It has to be technical. If you study something in the humanities, well, good luck, but you probably won't be very successful. So I took her advice, and I came to CMU very ready to study chemical engineering. I liked chemistry and engineering. Well, when I told people I wanted to study chemical engineering, they said, "Ooh." And I sort of liked that sound. Like I liked when people said to me, "Ooh." And so I thought, great, chemical engineering will work really well. So I came to this place, which is 3 times the size of my hometown, and I said, I'm going to settle in here, and I'm going to learn chemical engineering, and it's going to be great. So I came my freshman year. For those chemical engineering students in the audience, you might remember this textbook from our first class. And I think very quickly I realized that I was not going to be studying something very technical, at least not engineering, at Carnegie Mellon. Whoops. Sorry. I'm going to give this to you, Ted. All right. So I realized I was going to be studying something very technical at Carnegie Mellon. My first calc exam I actually took in this room, in that seat right there between you two. It was horrible. It was one of my worst experiences here. I went home to my room and I cried for about 30 minutes because I told myself that I didn't belong here, because I couldn't ace that calc exam. And because not acing that calc exam meant that I might not do very well. But I stuck with chemical engineering for a little while, and finally in my sophomore year, I realized that I was encountering a very cyclical problem. See, the problem was that I didn't like what I was studying. And because I didn't like what I was studying, I didn't work very hard. And because I didn't work very hard, I did really poorly. And because I was doing poorly, I didn't like what I was studying. And it sort of went around and around and around, and I didn't know what to do. And I couldn't really admit that, because if I admitted that, it meant that I wasn't working hard enough, or that I couldn't be smart enough to do it, or that maybe chemical engineering wasn't right for me. But finally, at the beginning of my junior year, I said, I need to take a step back. This just really isn't working. Fluids, thermodynamics, I really hated all of it. And I didn't really know why I put myself through it for 2 years. So on the ad drop deadline of my junior year, 2 weeks into the semester, I went to my advisor and I said, I really don't think this is for me. And then I went to talk to the bio department and I said, I really don't think chemical engineering is for me. And I went to the psychology department and I called my parents and then I cried a little bit. And then I went back to my advisors and then I went to the career services and I took a career placement exam. I think number 1 was like counseling, 2 was teaching, 3 was politics, and like 54th was engineering. And I thought, nothing is telling me that I should be an engineer right now. So I cried a little bit more, called my parents one more time, and at 5 p.m., I dropped all of my classes and became a biopsych major with a minor in biomedical engineering. And from that day onwards, I could not have been happier with my classes. I was that student who wanted to talk about what I was learning. That cool thing that I did in lab, I was interested in explaining it. And that was a feeling that I hadn't had before in my time at CMU. But I was left with one problem. Because if I hadn't been successful in chemical engineering, then what? Had I been a failure? Had I not been successful in what I came to CMU to do, and because I wasn't successful was the only alternative for me to be a failure? That was a really big question for me to ask. And it's interesting because when I was invited to speak tonight, part of the email said, you've been nominated because people here at CMU consider what you've done as a student to be success. So that got me thinking, and I sort of wondered what success is and what success means. So one thing that got me started on my search was a quote that Maya Angelou said, which is this, that success is liking yourself, liking what you do, and liking how you do it. Now this is really interesting, and it got me thinking, but it was also a little bit vague. It really didn't tell me that much necessarily. So I used some of my biopsych skills to look a little bit at the brain and try to figure out what exactly does success look like. So what I did is I pulled out the areas of the brain that we see that are activated during times when people are feeling success. Now I know this might be a little bit over some people's heads, bear with me. I think we can all get it, but if you have any questions, please ask. So to get here, I used a tool called Neurosynth. What Neurosynth does, it's an online database, and it scrolls through all of these databases of a whole bunch of different articles that have to do with fMRI studies. So it takes a whole bunch of articles and it says, what are the key terms in these articles? So in the articles that I was looking at, I was looking for the key terms that had to do with success. Studies that looked to see what people felt like when they were being successful. Then what Neurosynth does is it takes the coordinates that have to do with the areas of your brain and it pulls out the areas that were the most highly activated. So what we end up with is that lovely picture of the brain that I showed you before that has those different areas of activation. Now that wasn't really enough for me because I tend to be sort of a curious person, and I wanted to go a step further, and I wanted to understand how are these areas interacting. So I made this, which may look even a little bit more intimidating than the last one, but believe me, it's really not too complicated to understand. What we have going on here is I used a processing device that looks to see how the molecules in your brain move. If we know how water molecules in your brain move, we then can understand the way that the tracks in your brain may be connected. If you have one area of your brain here and you have another area of your brain here, how do they talk to each other? And so that's what this is. This is a picture that's been all pulled together of all of the different areas and all of the connections that end in those areas. So if we just back up a step, we can look, we have this red area here and some of its connections. And as we move forward, we add the areas that come out of each of the different connections. And as you can see, it's pretty darn connected. Almost every part of your brain has some sort of connection in and out of it that is landing in an area that's activated during feelings of success. So I wanted to sort of break that down and understand how your brain may be involved in the success that you're feeling. And one of the things that I think some of you probably have heard, I know that I've heard, is this idea that success begets success. It's this feeling that when you're successful in one thing, you have a higher likelihood of being successful in another thing. That if you have a really successful drive into work, then you'll probably be a little bit more successful in that morning of work, or maybe that afternoon of work, than you would have been if you hadn't been successful that morning. And I was wondering why this happened. So if we look at the brain, there's one very particular place here, which is your rewards pathway. We can see from this red area coming out here that we have connections that all move in this direction, and they move towards something that's called your ventral striatum. Your ventral striatum has been known to be activated in times when you feel reward. When you feel good about what you've done and you feel very excited, your reward pathway is going to light up. And I think it's very telling that we see this major area of success running into this other major area that talks about rewards, because we can feel this reward when we're successful, and as we feel that, we're going to be encouraged to do similar things to help us feel that again. But one question, that's the area. But one question that I have is, how do we know when we've achieved this success? When do we evaluate if we've been successful people? If we know that success begets success, then we should try to encourage ourselves to feel as successful as possible. Although I think that there's a little bit of a problem in this system. You see, I feel like we check our success at maybe not the most optimum times. One time that comes to mind for me is New Year's. I think on New Year's Eve, people are very good at deciding whether or not they've been successful in their last year, and they set goals for the next year. Although, if anyone in the audience is like me, those goals, those New Year's resolutions, probably last about a week, maybe a month if you're lucky. They don't go very far. And we're not checking those goals again until an entire year later. How are we helping ourselves feel successful if we're looking on such a long time scale? Maybe a time scale that's a little bit shorter is when we think about GPAs, and we think about the success that we feel at the end of a semester. So you go through your entire semester doing a ton of work, and you get to the end of the semester and you check that GPA, and if it's really high and awesome in year 4, then you're probably pretty excited. You feel like you've been successful. But if it's not near 4, you maybe don't feel as successful and you feel hard on yourselves. But again, we're checking after that's happened, after those numbers have been set in stone. Another time that's even on a shorter time scale, but I think is also troublesome, is when you realize in the middle of the test that you haven't been successful. You're taking the test and all of a sudden you stumble upon those problems that you don't know how to fix, and you realize that you haven't really been successful enough in your studying, but at that point, again, it's too late. I propose that we look at success in smaller pieces, in thinking about the goals that we have on a short-term scale. If my goal is to study 2 hours tonight, at the end of the night, I'm going to be able to decide whether or not I was successful. And if I wasn't successful, I'll be able to go and change that for the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until that test comes. And then hopefully I won't have that horrible pit feeling in the bottom of my stomach when the test comes and I realize that I haven't been successful. Hopefully I've been able to catch that earlier on. One thing that I think is very important in this process, though, is that change is really, really key. That if you haven't been successful once, you can't just try harder to be successful again. I think sometimes we as CMU students are a little bit too much like this graphic here, where if it doesn't work, we just push ourselves a little harder. If studying a few hours wasn't enough, I'm just going to study a few more. And if that wasn't enough, maybe I'll just pull an all-nighter. And that just continues and continues and continues. And I think we wear ourselves out in pushing harder and harder. But if we can take a step back and sort of look to see where our success is going, and look to see what changes we can make to be more successful, I think on the whole, we're going to be a lot happier students. Another thing that goes into success, obviously, is confidence. Some of you may have heard the saying that confidence is key. I think this saying is a little bit misconstruing, though, because it makes it sound like confidence is really easy. Like confidence is key, so you should just take it and have it, and then you'll be great if you have confidence. At least in my experience, confidence is challenging. Confidence is really, really difficult. It might sound a little bit strange, but I don't consider myself to be a very confident person. I really struggle with that, and oftentimes in situations, particularly social situations, I feel like I need to be a leader, because if I'm a leader, I can take a step back out of the situation, and then I don't have to feel so self-conscious. But if I'm just there in the mix of all my peers, I feel very, very self-conscious. Now, this was something that was a little bit of a stressor for me when it came time for running for student body president, because it was very hard for me to be confident enough to admit that I wanted to be student body president. It was almost embarrassing in a way. Like, people would say, "Why would you want to be student body president? You'd be horrible at that." And it took a lot for me to build up the courage and the confidence to say, this is what I want to do. It took talking to friends and talking to those support systems that convinced me that, no, I probably would do an okay job at it, and you should probably go for it and just see what it's like. And I think that we all probably, at least I hope, have those support systems in our lives. And it's important in these times when we feel that lacking of confidence to turn to those support systems so that we feel like we can be successful. Now we also see this playing into the brain in some ways. You can notice this green area here, which our arrow is pointing to. Right behind that red area, the green area is called your amygdala. Now your amygdala has been found to be very important when we think about things like emotional memory and fear reduction and anxiety. And it's interesting to me to see that that is activated in these different areas that are activated when it comes to success. But I think that it makes sense because as you're approaching success, you may feel like you're lacking that confidence. And your amygdala might be telling you, hey, you should slow down, you maybe want to run away, this could be a little bit scary. But you have to remember those support systems that you have and rely on that confidence to shush your amygdala down and feel like you can be successful. So we've sort of gone over some big key topics here. Just to recap, we can talk about the importance of success and the ways that we see it activated in your brain. We can also talk about how the fact that success begets success. We're looking at the timeline that we're monitoring success, and also that change and confidence are both important and involved in success. But that sort of left me with one big question, because although I understood how success was working in the brain, I still didn't really feel like I knew what success was. So I looked up a definition of it, which was a little difficult because I'm not really sure the last time I actually used a dictionary, but I got this definition, which is a little peculiar because I think that I remember in like 5th grade, my English teacher telling me that you can't define a word with the word. So that sort of takes out 4 and 3 for me, because if your performance is marked by success, I'm not going to tell me myself that that is what success is. Definition 2 also bothers me a little bit because I feel like I don't necessarily need to be wealthy to be successful. I also feel like there are probably a lot of people in the world who are now considered to be very honorable that probably weren't honorable when they were alive. And does that mean that they weren't successful in their lifetime? I don't really think so. So none of those really sat well with me. The only one that I sort of was okay with was this idea that success is defined by the accomplishment of one's goals. And the reason why this sat well with me was because I felt like it allowed each and every one of us to define our own success. Now this is the big takeaway point for me. This is the thing that I feel like I've really learned at CMU, which is the ability to define your own success. We see that success is so important in the brain, but sometimes I feel like we define success based on some very, very big standards. I think that socially we have very high standards for what success looks like. For what a successful business person looks like, I'm sure that you can think of that in your mind. For what a successful supermodel looks like, I'm sure you also have an image of that. And sometimes these social constructs aren't really what defines my success and defines the way that I feel good about myself and feel success all around me. This came into play for me in some ways when I was teaching in a Pittsburgh school over the summer, a few summers ago. And I was teaching a student, and we were trying to learn dimensional analysis. He was taking chemistry as a summer course, and he wanted to understand what dimensional analysis was as part of the process. Now, we worked really hard at this, and for me personally, I don't think that dimensional analysis is something that's too difficult to understand. Maybe some of you know it. It's when you start with 2 values and you want to get to 2 different values, and you use a lot of cross-multiplication in the process. And I was working with him, and working with him, and working with him, and he was really, really struggling. And we didn't really know why until finally I got to the point when I realized that he, as a junior in high school, didn't know what fractions were. And if you can't understand fractions, you probably aren't going to be able to understand dimensional analysis. So we put dimensional analysis away for the day, and instead we talked about pi. And we talked about the way fractions and pi are very similar and how they interact, and at the end of the day he said, wow, no one's ever explained it to me like that. I think I get it. I think I understand fractions now. Now, if we take a step back, what was his goal? His goal for the day was to learn dimensional analysis, so we definitely didn't do that. But I also didn't want him to end the day feeling like he'd been a failure, because we know that success begets success. And so if he's been a failure, how is he going to come back the next day and get back at that dimensional analysis? So instead, we defined our own success. We said that his job for the day had been to learn fractions, that he did a great job at that, and that we hoped that he would come back the next day ready to learn, and maybe to understand another component of dimensional analysis. So maybe at the end of the week, he could take a step back and say, wow, I get that thing, that big thing now. Breaking down his goal of dimensional analysis into small steps helped him to feel successful along the way. I also came across this last summer when I went to Kenya. I went to Kenya and I went to be a teacher there, and I was there for 5 weeks. And I think, although I don't like to admit it, I think a small part of me when I got on that plane thought, wow, I'm gonna go to Africa and I'll probably just save Africa. Like maybe I'll just get there and then I'll save Africa and it'll be awesome and everyone will be great and it'll be really fun and it'll be really awesome. And I arrived, and again, I think that first day I realized that I'm not gonna be saving Africa. It was hard. We didn't have running water. There were students drinking out of puddles in the street. There were many students who commuted many, many miles to get to school, and I realized that I wasn't gonna save Africa. But what I did realize is that I could make connections, that I could talk to these students, that they could change my life, and that maybe I could make them smile. Maybe I could shake their hands, and maybe I could help them have a little bit brighter of a day. And that's what success became for me. It became those daily interactions that I had with students. It didn't become saving Africa. It didn't even become teaching these students amazing, wonderful things. But it came more about my experience and my relationships with them. And so that sort of brings me to this big and last final point, is that throughout my time at CMU and throughout all of the experiences that I have, I really have learned how to define my own success. I've learned and understood that although I will not be graduating with a chemical engineering degree, I have been very successful in my process here as a student. And that all of you can also be very successful in your times here as a CMU student. Because we can each enjoy and define our own success. And as we enjoy and define that, we can be successful as a larger community. Not as a community that all necessarily shares these same standards of success. Success is not a blanket term that we can just sort of pull across and say that if you do this, if you study that technical degree, then you'll be successful. But rather, success is something that lives much closer to home. And success is there and able for each and every one of us to define. And if we can define that, we can all enjoy it and be successful together. Thank you.